Sands before revelation. Before any prophet speaks, before any scripture is revealed, there is always a land quietly shaping the people who walk upon it. The story of Islam begins long before the 7th century, long before Mecca becomes a name known across the world. It begins with geography, with climate, with the slow rhythms of survival on the Arabian Peninsula. Arabia lies between worlds. To the north were the great empires of late antiquity, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, and the Sasanian Persian Empire, proud and ancient. To the south, the monsoon winds carried ships toward East Africa and India. Yet Arabia itself was largely ignored by imperial armies. Its deserts were vast, its water scarce, its cities few and separated by long stretches of sand and stone. This isolation did not make Arabia empty. It made it resilient. The peninsula was a land of contrasts. Along the coasts and in the southern highlands, rainfall allowed agriculture to take root. In Yemen, ancient kingdoms such as Saba and Himyar had once built dams, irrigated fields, and traded frankincense and myrrh to the wider world. But much of Arabia was dry and unforgiving. Life here demanded movement. Tribes followed grazing routes, wells, and seasonal rains. Survival depended on kinship, honor, and memory. Arab society before Islam was organized around tribes and clans. Identity flowed through bloodlines and ancestry recited in poetry and preserved in story. Loyalty to one's tribe was a moral obligation, stronger than law. Protection, vengeance, generosity, and reputation formed the unwritten code by which people lived. In a land without centralized authority, justice was negotiated, remembered, and enforced by custom. Poetry held special power. It was more than art, it was history, law, and weapon. A poet could immortalize bravery or shame, an enemy for generations. Gatherings where poetry was recited were moments of shared culture when tribes briefly set aside rivalries to listen, judge, and remember. Words mattered deeply in a world where memory was the primary archive. Religion in pre-Islamic Arabia was diverse and layered. Most tribes practiced forms of polytheism, venerating deities associated with natural forces, ancestors, or local shrines. Stones, trees, and springs could become sacred through tradition and use. Yet Arabia was not isolated from monotheism. Jewish communities lived in places such as Yathrib, later known as Medina. Christian tribes inhabited parts of the north and the southern edges of the peninsula. Stories of prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, were known, though often fragmented and retold through oral tradition. At the heart of Western Arabia stood Mecca, a city unlike any other in the region. It was not fertile nor politically powerful, but it was sacred. The Kaaba, a cube-shaped sanctuary, stood at its center. According to tradition, it was linked to Abraham and his son Ishmael, though over time it had become home to many tribal idols. Pilgrimage to the Kaaba brought tribes together in periods of truce, creating moments of peace in an otherwise violent landscape. Trade followed pilgrimage, and Mecca grew wealthy through its position as both spiritual and commercial crossroads. Caravans passed through Mecca, carrying leather, spices, textiles, and stories. Merchants traveled north toward Syria and south toward Yemen, navigating not only deserts but the complex politics of tribal alliances. The Quraysh tribe, custodians of the Kaaba, gained influence through their role as hosts and protectors of pilgrims. Their authority rested not on armies but on custom, reputation, and control of trade networks. Beyond Arabia, the wider world was restless. The Byzantine and Persian empires had spent decades locked in exhausting wars. Cities were taxed heavily, populations displaced, and religious disputes sharpened tensions. Christianity itself was divided by theological arguments that ordinary people struggled to follow. Judaism endured under foreign rule, preserving identity through law and scripture. Across these lands, many sensed that the old order was strained, that something was shifting beneath the surface. Arabia felt these pressures indirectly. Trade routes shifted as wars disrupted traditional paths. Refugees and ideas crossed borders. Monotheistic concepts, one God, final judgment, moral accountability circulated alongside older beliefs. The peninsula became a quiet meeting place of ancient traditions and new questions. Daily life remained simple and demanding. Water was drawn carefully from wells. Tents were packed and unpacked with the seasons. In towns, markets filled with voices bargaining over grain cloth and metal goods. At night, fires flickered beneath open skies thick with stars. People spoke of fate, of fortune, of unseen forces shaping human lives. They prayed to many gods, to ancestral spirits, or simply to whatever power governed the desert winds. Yet beneath the surface of tribal loyalty and ritual practice, moral unease existed. Inequality was sharp. Orphans and widows were vulnerable. Debt could lead to slavery. Infanticide, particularly of girls, occurred in some tribes driven by fear of poverty or shame. Generosity was praised, but exploitation persisted. Mercy existed, but it depended on personal character rather than shared law. This was not a world waiting passively for change, but one quietly prepared for it. The peninsula had learned how to listen to poetry, to memory, to whispered stories carried by traders and pilgrims. It understood survival discipline and devotion. It knew how to preserve words and repeat them until they shaped identity. As the 6th century drew toward its end, Mecca continued its rhythms of trade and pilgrimage. Children were born into clans, names were recited, alliances renewed. Among them was a boy from the Quraysh tribe, orphaned early, growing up amid caravans and sacred stone. No one yet knew that the silence of the desert around him would one day be broken by words believed to come from beyond the world. For now the sands remained still. The Kaaba stood quiet beneath the sun. Empires to the north and east strained under their own weight. And in the long, patient flow of time, Arabia waited, unaware that it was about to become the center of a story that would echo across centuries. As night settles over the peninsula and the caravan fires dim one by one, the stage is set for a voice that will soon speak from the depths of a mountain cave, carrying with it a message that will reshape belief, law, and history itself. The man in Mecca. Mecca in the late 6th century stirred awake each morning beneath a pale desert sun. Shadows stretched across stone paths as merchants opened their stalls, and the scent of leather incense and dust mingled in the air. Pilgrims arrived in small groups, their animals tired from the road, their voices softened by the sacred truths that surrounded the city. Life here moved with purpose, yet beneath the bustle there was a careful stillness, a sense that tradition watched over every step. It was into this world that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born around the year 570. His lineage connected him to the Quraysh, the tribe entrusted with the care of the Kaaba. Yet his early life was marked not by privilege, but by loss. His father Abdullah died before Muhammad was born. His mother Amina would pass away when he was still a young child. Orphanhood in Arabia was a fragile state, one that exposed a child to uncertainty and dependence on the goodwill of others. He was taken first into the care of his grandfather Abd al-Muttalib, a respected elder of the Quraysh. When the old man died, Muhammad passed into the household of his uncle Abu Talib, a man of modest means, but strong character. Abu Talib offered protection and affection, though not wealth. From an early age, Muhammad learned the rhythms of responsibility, accompanying caravans and observing the careful negotiations that governed trade and tribal relations. As he grew, his reputation quietly formed. He was known among the people of Mecca as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, in a society where contracts were sealed by memory and honor rather than ink, and sealed trust was a rare and valuable currency. Muhammad earned it not through ambition, but through consistency by keeping his word, returning goods faithfully, and speaking carefully. He did not dominate gatherings with poetry or boast of lineage. Instead, he listened. Trade took him beyond Mecca. Traveling north toward Syria, he encountered lands shaped by older empires and older faiths. Churches stood where desert tents could not. Stories of prophets and scriptures circulated among merchants. Though Muhammad was not learned in letters, he absorbed the world through observation. The contrasts between wealth and poverty, power and humility seemed to weigh upon him. In Mecca, society remained divided. The Quraysh prospered, yet not all shared equally in that prosperity. The city's wealth flowed through a small elite, while many struggled at the margins. Orphans, widows, and the poor relied on charity that was given at will, not as obligation. The Kaaba stood at the center, surrounded by idols, each representing a tribe or deity. Yet moral certainty felt scattered, divided among customs, rather than unified by principle. Around the age of 25, Muhammad's life took a steady turn. A wealthy widow named Khadija bint Khuwaylid, impressed by his honesty, entrusted him with her trade goods. His conduct on these journeys confirmed her trust, and soon she proposed marriage. Khadija was older, respected, and independent, a rare position for a woman in that society. Their marriage was marked by companionship and mutual respect, and it offered Muhammad a stability he had never known. Their household became a place of quiet order. Children were born, some of whom did not survive infancy, a common sorrow of the time. Through joy and grief, Khadija remained his closest confidant. She believed in his character long before the world would question it. Their home stood not far from the Kaaba, yet their lives were not centered on ritual alone. They were shaped by reflection. As the years passed, Muhammad grew increasingly withdrawn from Meccan society's excesses. The rituals of idol worship did not bring him peace. The inequalities of the city troubled him. He was known to seek solitude, walking beyond the crowded streets into the surrounding hills. There, away from voices and bargaining, the desert spoke in its own language of endurance, of silence, of vastness, beyond human control. One place drew him repeatedly, the cave of Hira, a narrow opening in the rocky slopes overlooking Mecca. From there the city appeared small, its noise softened by distance. Muhammad would spend nights in contemplation, especially during the month later known as Ramadan. He brought simple provisions, watched the stars, and thought deeply about creation justice and the unseen order of the world. Mecca continued its cycles below him. Pilgrims came and went. Festivals filled the sanctuary with sound. Idols were polished and adorned, yet in the cave there was only whinstone and breath. It was a space that asked questions rather than offering answers. At 40 years of age, an age considered one of maturity and balance in Arabian culture, Muhammad's solitude would be interrupted by an experience that would alter the course of his life and history itself. But before that moment arrived, His life remained outwardly unremarkable. He held no office commanded, no tribe claimed no authority. He was a merchant, a husband, a father, known for integrity and reflection. This ordinariness mattered. It rooted what was to come in the familiar soil of human life. The man who would soon speak words believed to be divine was shaped first by loss, by labor, by marriage, and by quiet thought. He knew hunger and comfort, trust and vulnerability. He had listened more than he had spoken. As the nights lengthened and the desert winds cooled, Muhammad returned again to the cave. Below him, Mecca slept unaware that its future was already forming in the stillness above. The city's idols stood silent, their shadows unmoving. The caravans would soon depart again, carrying goods and stories across the sands. And in the hush of the mountain, where the world seemed distant and small, the silence was about to be broken, not by thunder or fire, but by a command whispered into human history, calling one man to listen, and through him, calling the world to hear. The moment of revelation draws near like dawn, before the sun is seen, and the quiet of Arabia holds its breath, as a voice prepares to speak from the depths of the cave. The voice in the cave night settled gently over the mountains surrounding Mecca. The city below dimmed as fires were banked, and voices faded into sleep. Above it all, the cave of Hira rested in darkness, its narrow mouth opening toward the sky. Inside, Muhammad sat alone, wrapped in stillness, his thoughts moving slowly through questions that had no clear answers. The desert air was cool, and the silence felt deep, almost alive. It was during one of these nights, when the world seemed paused between breath and breath, that the moment came. Without warning, the quiet was broken by a presence that filled the small space of the cave. Muhammad felt seized, overwhelmed by something beyond his understanding. According to later accounts, an angel stood before him, Gabriel, bearing words not of human origin. The command was simple and terrifying in its clarity: recite. Muhammad, unlettered and unprepared, answered honestly that he could not. The command came again, pressing upon him until words formed words he would later repeat exactly as he heard them, words that would be preserved, memorized, and written down by others. They spoke of creation of humanity, shaped from a clot of blood, of a Lord who teaches by the pen, who teaches humanity what it did not know. The experience was not comforting. It was overwhelming, physical, and disorienting. When it ended, the cave returned to silence, but Muhammad was shaken to his core. He descended the mountain in fear, his heart racing, his sense of the world altered beyond repair. The familiar streets of Mecca felt suddenly distant, as if he were seeing them from another life. He went directly to Khadijah. Wrapped in a cloak, trembling, he told her what had happened. Her response was calm and steady. She listened without doubt, without dismissal. She reminded him of his character, his honesty, his kindness to the weak, his reliability. A man like this, she believed, that would not be abandoned or deceived by God. Seeking further reassurance, Khadijah took him to her cousin Waraka ibn Nawfal, a learned man familiar with Christian scriptures. After hearing Muhammad's account, Waraka spoke words, both confirming and foreboding. The being Muhammad had encountered, he said, was the same messenger who had come to Moses. If this was true, opposition would follow. Prophets were rarely welcomed by their own people. For a time, the revelations paused. Muhammad returned to his life unsettled, unsure of what lay ahead. Then, gradually, the voice returned, not always with the same force, but with persistence. Verses came in moments of solitude and moments of daily life, sometimes brief, sometimes extended. Each time Muhammad listened and memorized repeating the words carefully so they would not be lost. The message that emerged was uncompromising in its simplicity. There was one God, Allah, without partner or image. This God was merciful and just, the creator and sustainer of all things. Humanity was accountable to him. Wealth, lineage, and power offered no protection from judgment. What mattered was faith, righteousness, care for the vulnerable, and humility before the divine. This message challenged the foundations of Meccan society. Idol worship was not merely religious practice, it was economic and political structure. Pilgrimage sustained trade, tribal gods sustained identity. To reject them was to threaten both belief and livelihood. Yet Muhammad did not begin by preaching publicly. For several years the message was shared quietly within a small circle. The first to believe were those closest to him. Khadija accepted the message without hesitation, becoming the first Muslim. His young cousin Ali, living in his household, followed. His close friend Abu Bakr, a respected merchant, also believed, and through him others joined, men and women free and enslaved, young and old. What united them was not status, but conviction. They gathered discreetly, often in private homes, to listen as Muhammad recited the revelations. The Quran, as it would come to be called, was not delivered all at once. It unfolded over years, responding to circumstances, offering guidance, warning, comfort, and reflection. Its language echoed the poetic traditions of Arabia, yet differed in rhythm and authority, claiming a source beyond human craft. As the community grew, so did opposition. When Muhammad eventually began to recite publicly near the Kaaba, reactions hardened. Some mocked the message as poetry or sorcery. Others accused him of inventing stories from earlier scriptures. Leaders of the Quraysh worried less about theology than disruption. A society built on hierarchy felt threatened by a message that spoke of moral equality before God. Persecution followed gradually. Those without tribal protection, especially slaves and the poor, suffered the most. Some were beaten, others pressured to renounce their faith. Muhammad urged patience and restraint. The revelations emphasized endurance, reminding believers that earlier prophets had faced rejection. Justice, they were told, would come not through revenge, but through steadfastness. Despite hardship, the message continued to spread. Its appeal lay partly in its clarity, partly in its moral force. It offered dignity to the marginalized and accountability to the powerful. It spoke of a final day when all actions would be weighed, when secrets would be revealed, and when mercy would be granted by God alone. The early Muslims were few, but their bonds were strong. They memorized the revelations carefully, repeating them in prayer and daily life. Writing materials were scarce, so memory became sacred ground. Each verse was carried in the mind, guarded by repetition. The Quran lived first as sound as recitation, before it would ever exist as a book. Outside this small community, Mecca remained restless. Negotiations were attempted. Some Quraysh leaders offered compromise, wealth, status, authority, if Muhammad would abandon his message. He refused. The revelations left no room for shared divinity or partial truth. Monotheism was not negotiable. As tensions rose, so did the clarity of division. To follow Muhammad now required courage. Faith was no longer private reflection. It was public stance. Families were divided, friendships strained. Yet the message endured, carried not by force but by words, spoken steadily, patiently, again and again. Years passed in this uneasy balance. Revelation continued. The community grew slowly, pressure intensified. Mecca, once a familiar home, began to feel constricting, hostile. The message of Islam was clear, but its place in Mecca was increasingly uncertain. And so, as the words of the Quran spoke of exile, of perseverance, and of divine purpose unfolding through hardship, the idea of leaving Mecca, once unthinkable, began to take shape. The desert winds shifted. The voice from the cave continued to speak, and the path of Islam, no longer confined to quiet gatherings, began to turn outward toward a journey that would redefine time itself. The road to Medina. The years in Mecca had grown heavy. What began as quiet disbelief had hardened into open hostility, and the narrow streets of the city now carried suspicion as easily as they once carried trade and laughter. For the small Muslim community, faith had become a daily act of endurance. Each revealed verse brought comfort and strength, yet each public recitation also sharpened the anger of those who felt their world slipping from familiar foundations. The Quraysh leaders tightened their pressure. Social boycotts were imposed, cutting Muslims off from trade and marriage. Families were urged to abandon sons and daughters who followed Muhammad. For a time, Muhammad and his clan were forced to withdraw to a narrow valley outside the city where provisions were scarce and nights were long. Hunger and isolation tested resolve, but the community endured, sustained by shared belief and quiet solidarity. Amid this hardship, loss came close and personal. Khadija, Muhammad's closest companion and greatest source of comfort, died after years of strain. Soon after, Abu Talib, his uncle and protector, also passed away. With them gone, Muhammad stood more exposed than ever. Mecca, once home, now felt uncertain and dangerous. Later generations would remember this period as the year of sorrow, a time when grief and vulnerability settled like dust upon the heart. Yet even in this darkness, the message did not end. Revelation continued, offering reassurance that suffering was neither meaningless nor permanent. The Quran spoke of earlier prophets driven from their homes, of communities rebuilt elsewhere, of patience rewarded in ways unseen. These words began to reshape the community's sense of direction. Survival might require movement. Beyond Mecca, the world was still listening. Each year, tribes from across Arabia traveled to Mecca for pilgrimage and trade. Muhammad used these gatherings to speak quietly with visitors, explaining his message and seeking protection for his followers. Many listened politely and moved on. But from a town north of Mecca, Yathrib, came a different response. Yathrib was a place of divided loyalties. Its population was made up of Arab tribes long locked in conflict alongside Jewish communities who held their own traditions of scripture and law. Years of bloodshed had left the town weary and searching for stability. When a small group from Yathrib heard Muhammad speak of monotheism, justice, and communal responsibility, they recognized something they needed. They returned the following year with more people pledging loyalty and promising protection. These agreements, remembered as the pledges of Aqaba, were quiet but momentous. For the first time, Muhammad had not only followers, but a potential home, a place where the message of Islam might be lived openly, not merely endured. Gradually, Muhammad instructed his followers to leave Mecca and travel to Yathrib. They departed in small groups, often under cover of night, leaving behind homes, wealth, and familiarity. Their journey was not simply physical. It was a passage from persecution to possibility. In Yathrib, they would become known as the Muhajirun, the emigrants defined not by tribe but by shared faith. The Quraysh, alarmed by this growing movement, resolved to act decisively. They feared that Muhammad's relocation would give him the political strength Mecca had denied him. Plans were made to kill him, carefully devised, so that responsibility would be shared among tribes and no single clan could be blamed. On the night the plan was set to unfold, Muhammad quietly left his home, entrusting Ali to remain behind and return valuables that had been left in his care. Accompanied by Abu Bakr, he slipped out of the city and took refuge in a cave south of Mecca. For days they remained hidden, the world narrowing to darkness, breath, and trust. According to tradition, pursuers came close enough to see the cave's entrance, yet turned away, convinced no one could be inside. When the danger passed, the journey north began in earnest. The route avoided main caravan paths winding through desert and rock. Days were spent walking beneath an open sky, nights resting beneath stars that had guided travelers for generations. This was not the march of an army, but the careful movement of faith carried by fragile human bodies. When Muhammad finally reached Yathrib, the town welcomed him with relief and hope. Crowds gathered, voices rising not in anger, but in greeting. His arrival marked not just a personal escape, but the birth of a new community. Yathrib soon became known as Medina Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. Here Islam would take on new form. No longer only a message of belief, it would become a way of organizing life, socially, legally, spiritually. Muhammad's role expanded. He was still a prophet reciting revelation, but he also became a mediator, a leader, a builder of unity among diverse groups. The Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Medina, would later be chosen as the starting point of the Islamic calendar. Not because it marked a victory, but because it marked transformation. Faith had moved from survival to structure, from private conviction to communal reality. As the dust of the journey settled and Medina's palm groves replaced Mecca's stone, a new chapter began. The revelations would now speak to governance, to conflict, to coexistence. Islam had found a home, but the path ahead, shaped by alliances and trials, would demand wisdom as much as devotion. And so, beneath unfamiliar skies, the community gathered to build something new, unaware that the quiet agreements made in Medina would soon ripple outward, reshaping Arabia and beyond. Faith tested by the sword, Medina settled into its new rhythms slowly. Palm groves whispered in the wind, wells reflected the open sky, and the narrow paths between homes carried unfamiliar footsteps. The emigrants from Mecca, the Muhajirun, arrived with little more than their faith. The people of Medina who welcomed them became known as the Ansar, the helpers sharing food, shelter, and labor in an act of solidarity rare in a tribal world. Muhammad worked patiently to weave these groups into a single community. Bonds of brotherhood were established, pairing families across tribal lines. Old rivalries were softened, not erased, but held in check by shared responsibility. Agreements were written to define mutual rights and obligations, including those of the Jewish tribes of Medina. This charter, later remembered as the Constitution of Medina, outlined a plural society bound together by collective defense and justice. For the first time, Islam existed not only as belief, but as lived social order. Yet peace in Medina did not mean safety from the outside world. Mecca watched carefully. The Quraysh had lost control of their most persistent critic, but not their concern. Trade routes northward now passed near Medina, and the presence of Muhammad and his followers was seen as both a spiritual and economic threat. The memory of insult and rejection still lingered, sharpened by fear of growing influence. The revelations during this period reflected the new reality. They spoke of patience, but also of permission to defend. For years in Mecca, Muslims had been instructed to endure persecution without retaliation. Now in Medina, verses acknowledged the right to resist oppression and protect the community. This shift was not a call to conquest, but a recognition that survival sometimes required strength. The first encounters were cautious. Small expeditions were sent to monitor Quraysh caravans asserting presence rather than seeking battle. These movements carried symbolic weight. They signaled that the Muslims were no longer isolated individuals, but a community capable of coordinated action. The tension came to a head near a place called Badr. In the year 624, a small Muslim force set out with the intention of intercepting a Meccan caravan returning from Syria. The caravan escaped, but the Quraysh dispatched an armed force to assert dominance. The two groups met near wells on the desert plain. The Muslims were outnumbered, poorly equipped, and uncertain. Night fell, and prayers rose quietly in the camp, not for victory alone, but for steadiness. The battle that followed was brief, but decisive. Against expectation, the Muslims prevailed. In later remembrance, Badr became more than a military encounter. It was seen as a moment of divine reassurance, a sign that faith, discipline, and unity mattered as much as numbers. The victory strengthened the community's confidence and altered how surrounding tribes perceived them. But triumph carried consequences. Mecca could not ignore this defeat. The following year, the Quraysh returned with a larger force, meeting the Muslims near Mount Uhud. This time the outcome was mixed. Early success turned into confusion when some Muslim archers left their positions seeking spoils rather than holding formation. The Meccan cavalry exploited the opening, and losses followed. The lesson of Uhud was sobering. Revelation addressed it directly, reminding the community that discipline and obedience were as vital as courage. Victory was not guaranteed by faith alone. It required responsibility. The setback did not break the Muslims, but it humbled them, grounding confidence in reflection rather than certainty. As years passed, pressure mounted again. Meccan allies gathered intent on ending the Muslim presence in Medina altogether. In response, the community adopted a defensive strategy unfamiliar in Arabia. A trench was dug around the exposed side of the city, an idea learned through distant contacts with Persian lands. When the Allied forces arrived, they found themselves stalled, unable to cross. For weeks, the two sides faced one another across the trench, the desert wind carrying insults and prayers in equal measure. No decisive battle came. Instead, weather and logistics weakened the attackers. Eventually, the coalition dispersed. Medina had held not through force alone, but through preparation and unity. These years of conflict shaped the Muslim community deeply. Warfare was not glorified. Loss, uncertainty, and restraint remained present in the revelations. Rules emerged governing conduct, treatment of prisoners, and the limits of violence. The Quran emphasized that fighting was not an end in itself, but a response to aggression bound by moral accountability. Daily life continued alongside these trials. Markets reopened after tension eased. Children learned verses of the Quran by heart. Families planted crops, repaired homes, and mourned their dead quietly. Faith was no longer abstract. It was tested against fear, grief, and responsibility. The conflicts with Mecca were not merely struggles for territory. They were contests over legitimacy, belief, and the right to define Arabia's future. With each encounter, the balance shifted. Tribes began to reassess old alliances. Some entered into treaties with Muhammad, choosing coexistence over conflict. Slowly, the path toward Mecca itself began to reopen, not as an immediate conquest, but as an unresolved question. Could reconciliation replace hostility? Could the city that had expelled its prophet one day accept his message? As the dust settled after years of skirmish and standoff, the community in Medina stood more cohesive than before. They had learned restraint in victory and humility in defeat. The revelations continued, guiding them through complexity rather than certainty. And as the road south toward Mecca lay quiet once more, the possibility of return, peaceful or otherwise, hovered like a distant horizon, drawing the next chapter of the story ever closer. A prophet among his people. The years of tension gradually gave way to a quieter resolve. Medina had endured conflict, negotiation, and loss, and in doing so had become something more than a refuge. It was now the heart of a growing community bound not only by faith but by shared memory. The revelations that continued to arrive spoke increasingly of balance between justice and mercy, firmness and forgiveness, worldly responsibility and spiritual humility. Attention slowly turned again toward Mecca. In the 6th year after the Hijrah, Muhammad announced an intention that surprised many. He would travel to Mecca not to fight but to perform the pilgrimage rituals at the Kaaba. The act itself was symbolic. Pilgrimage was a rite recognized across Arabia, even among enemies. Yet the road to Mecca was still shadowed by past bloodshed, and the Quraysh were wary. The Muslims set out unarmed, dressed in the simple garments of pilgrimage. When the Quraysh blocked their entry near a place called Hudaybiyah, negotiations followed. Tension hung in the air, but words prevailed over weapons. The treaty that emerged seemed at first glance unequal. The Muslims agreed to return to Medina without entering Mecca that year, and accepted terms that favored the Quraysh. Some followers felt disappointment, yet the Quran described the treaty as a clear victory, not because of immediate gain, but because it opened the door to peace. The truce allowed people to meet, speak, and listen without fear. In the months that followed, Islam spread more rapidly than during years of conflict. Stability made space for reflection. Muhammad used this period to send messages beyond Arabia. Letters were carried to rulers in neighboring lands, Byzantine, Persian, and others, inviting them to consider the message of Islam. These gestures were calm and dignified, framed not as demands, but as invitations. They signaled that Islam now saw itself as part of the wider world. Meanwhile, alliances shifted. Tribes once hesitant now approached Medina willingly. Some entered Islam, others formed treaties of neutrality. The balance of power in Arabia was changing quietly, almost gently, without the collapse that so often accompanied change. When the truce with Mecca was eventually broken by Quraysh allies, the response from Medina was measured but decisive. Muhammad gathered a large force and marched toward Mecca. Yet there was no triumphal roar, no declaration of vengeance. As the city realized resistance was futile, leaders chose surrender. The entry into Mecca was marked by restraint. Muhammad lowered his head as he entered, not in pride, but humility. The city that had rejected him now lay open, and its fate rested in his hands. He declared a general amnesty. Those who had persecuted, mocked, and expelled him were forgiven. Violence was avoided wherever possible. At the Kaaba, the idols were removed one by one. The sanctuary was rededicated to the worship of one God. The act was profound not because of destruction, but because of restoration, returning the space in Islamic understanding to its original purpose. Mecca became once more a center of pilgrimage now unified under monotheism. For many Meccans, this moment reshaped belief. Islam was no longer an outsider's challenge, it was the organizing faith of Arabia. People entered it in large numbers, sometimes cautiously, sometimes with deep conviction. The message that had once been whispered now moved openly through streets and valleys. In the years that followed, delegations from across the peninsula came to Medina. This period became known as the Year of Delegations, as tribes sought guidance, alliance, or instruction. Muhammad taught patiently, emphasizing justice, prayer, charity, and accountability. His leadership remained personal and accessible. He mended clothes, listened to disputes, and spoke gently to children. The revelations during these final years addressed the completion of faith. They refined rituals, clarified ethical principles, and emphasized unity. Islam was no longer forming, it was settling into shape. During a final pilgrimage, Muhammad addressed a vast gathering. His words were calm and direct. He spoke of the sanctity of life and property, of the equality of believers, regardless of lineage or race, of the rights of women, and of the responsibility to convey the message faithfully. He reminded the listeners that he would not be among them forever. Not long after returning to Medina, illness overtook him. The community watched closely as their prophet weakened. Even then he emphasized prayer, kindness, and humility. When he passed away in 632, the city fell into stunned silence. Muhammad left no palace, no treasury, no written scripture in his own hand. What he left was a community shaped by belief, a body of revelation preserved through memory and recitation, and a model of leadership grounded in service. As the people gathered in grief, one question pressed heavily upon them: how would this community continue without the man who had guided it from the beginning? The answer would shape centuries to come as Islam moved from prophetic leadership into a new and uncertain chapter 1 that would carry the faith far beyond the sands of Arabia into the vast unfolding of history. The rightly guided. When the Prophet Muhammad passed away, Medina felt suddenly unanchored. The familiar rhythm of revelation, the steady presence of the man who had guided prayer and judgment alike, was gone. For many, the loss felt unbearable. Some refused to believe it, at first clinging to the hope that he would return as he had from so many trials before. The community stood at a threshold, united in faith, yet uncertain in direction. In those first hours, confusion threatened to fracture what had been so carefully built. Islam had grown around a prophet, but it had also taught that no human was eternal. Leadership now had to pass to someone else, not as a prophet, but as a guardian of the community. It was Abu Bakr, Muhammad's close companion and father-in-law, who spoke words that steadied the gathering. He reminded the people that Muhammad had been a messenger and that God alone was everlasting. Faith, he said, must not rest on a single life, but on the truth that life had carried. His calm clarity helped the community breathe again. Abu Bakr was chosen as Caliph, a word meaning successor or steward. His role was not to receive revelation, but to preserve unity, apply the Quran and prophetic example, and guide the growing Muslim society. His leadership began amid crisis. Several tribes, having pledged loyalty to Muhammad personally, now questioned their obligations. Some refused to pay the communal charity tax. Others followed new claimants to prophethood. These challenges were not merely political. They struck at the heart of what Islam meant, whether it was a temporary alliance or a lasting moral order. Abu Bakr responded firmly, insisting that faith could not be divided by convenience. Through a series of campaigns, the authority of the community was reasserted across Arabia. By the time Abu Bakr's short caliphate ended, the peninsula was once again unified. Leadership then passed to Umar ibn al-Khattab, a man known for his intensity, discipline, and deep sense of justice. Under Umar, the Muslim community entered a new phase. Arabia could no longer contain its momentum. Beyond its borders lay exhausted empires, weakened by years of war and internal strain. Muslim forces moved north and east, not as wandering raiders, but as organized armies, guided by clear leadership. They entered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Persia. Cities fell sometimes after resistance, sometimes through negotiation. Umar insisted on rules, protection for civilians, respect for religious communities, restraint in victory. Conquered peoples were not forced to convert. Instead, they were integrated into a system that allowed them to retain faith and property in exchange for loyalty and tax. The expansion was rapid, but it was not chaotic. Administrative systems were established, records were kept, judges were appointed. Umar himself lived simply walking the streets at night to observe the condition of his people. His leadership left a deep impression, shaping ideals of governance that would echo for generations. After Umar's assassination, leadership passed to Uthman ibn Affan, a respected elder from the Quraysh. His caliphate was marked by both continuity and tension. As the community expanded, further differences in practice and recitation of the Quran began to appear across distant regions. To preserve unity, Uthman ordered the compilation of an official written text of the Quran based on the recitations preserved by the Prophet's companions. Copies were sent across the empire, ensuring consistency. Yet Uthman's rule also faced criticism. Accusations of favoritism toward his relatives created unrest, especially in newly conquered lands, where expectations of equality were strong. Discontent grew slowly, then suddenly. Despite Uthman's gentle nature and reluctance to use force, rebellion reached Medina. He was killed in his own home reading the Quran. The community was shaken. Leadership passed to Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, known for his closeness to Muhammad and his deep knowledge of faith. Ali's caliphate, however, unfolded amid deep division. Questions over justice for Uthman's death split the community. Former allies turned into rivals. Battles between Muslims, once unthinkable, became reality. Ali sought reconciliation, but the wounds were raw. The conflict culminated in his assassination, bringing the era of the four Rashidun rightly guided caliphs to an end. This period, though brief, left a lasting imprint. It defined ideals of leadership rooted in moral responsibility, consultation, and restraint. It also revealed the challenges of sustaining unity as Islam moved from a small community into a vast and diverse world. As the dust settled on these early struggles, power began to shift toward a new form of rule, one more centralized, more dynastic. The faith endured, but its political expression was changing. And so, as the memory of the Prophet and his closest companions passed into reverent history, Islam stood poised to become not only a community of belief, but an empire, its next chapter unfolding beneath banners carried far beyond the horizons of Arabia. Empire of the Umayyads. As the era of the rightly guided caliphs faded into memory, the Muslim world entered a quieter, more complex transformation. The unity forged through shared faith remained, but leadership now moved along different lines. Authority passed into the hands of the Umayyad family, beginning with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, a seasoned administrator and governor of Syria. With him, the Caliphate took on a new character, less intimate, more imperial. The capital shifted from Medina to Damascus. This change was symbolic as much as practical. Medina had been the city of prophecy and community. Damascus stood at the crossroads of old empires, closer to the administrative traditions of Byzantium and Persia. Stone buildings replaced palm groves. Bureaucracy grew where personal consultation had once sufficed. The caliph was now not only a moral leader, but a ruler, presiding over a vast and growing state. Under the Umayyads, expansion continued at remarkable speed. Muslim armies moved west across North Africa, navigating deserts and coastal plains until they reached the Atlantic. In the early 8th century, they crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, where Visigothic rule collapsed with surprising swiftness. Al-Andalus, as the region came to be known, became a new western horizon of Islamic civilization. To the east, expansion pressed into Central Asia and the Indus Valley. Ancient cities, once shaped by Persian, Hellenistic, and Indian cultures, now found themselves woven into the Islamic world. Trade routes lengthened, languages mingled. Coins bearing Arabic inscriptions circulated across lands once ruled by emperors. Yet this growth brought challenges. The Umayyads ruled as an Arab elite over a population that was increasingly diverse. Many non-Arab converts to Islam, known as Mawali, embraced the faith but found themselves excluded from full social equality. Administrative systems still favored Arab lineage. Tensions simmered quietly beneath the surface of success. The caliphs themselves varied in character. Some ruled with restraint, others with ambition. Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan stands out as a figure who shaped the empire decisively. He standardized coinage, replacing Byzantine and Persian symbols with Islamic declarations of faith. Arabic was established as the language of administration, binding distant provinces together through a shared written tongue. Architecture, too, began to express Islamic identity. In Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock rose above the city, its golden form reflecting sunlight and memory alike. It was not a mosque in the conventional sense, but a statement of faith continuity and presence, built upon layers of sacred history. Daily life across the empire unfolded in countless variations. In cities, markets bustled with goods from across continents. Scholars debated law and theology. Farmers adapted new crops and irrigation techniques. In rural areas, traditions changed slowly, blending old customs with new religious rhythms. Despite these achievements, opposition grew. Some longed for the simplicity and equality of the early community. Others questioned the legitimacy of dynastic rule itself. Descendants of the Prophet's family felt sidelined. Non-Arab Muslims felt overlooked. The memory of earlier divisions had not faded. It had merely settled. In the East, a quiet movement took shape, drawing strength from grievance and hope alike. It promised renewal justice and a return to moral legitimacy. Black banners began to appear, carried by those who believed that the Caliphate had strayed too far from its origins. By the mid-8th century, the Umayyad order, so confident in its reach, found itself strained. Revolts flared, loyalties shifted. The empire that had expanded so swiftly now struggled to hold its center. When the Abbasid revolution finally swept through it, did so with decisive force. The Umayyad family was overthrown. Their rule ended in blood and flight. One branch escaped westward, carrying Umayyad legacy to Al-Andalus, where it would take root again in a new form. As Damascus fell silent and Baghdad's foundations were laid, the Islamic world prepared to enter another age, one less focused on conquest and more on thought learning and refinement. The empire had survived transformation before. It would do so again, reshaping itself as it moved toward a golden age, illuminated not only by power but by knowledge. Baghdad and the House of Wisdom. When the Abbasids took power, they did not merely replace one ruling family with another. They reoriented the Islamic world. The center of gravity shifted eastward, away from the Mediterranean influence of Damascus, and toward the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. There, amid canals, date palms, and ancient ruins, a new capital was founded, Baghdad. Baghdad was designed as a symbol of order and ambition. Its original form was circular, with the Caliph's palace and main mosque at the center, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Though this precise design would not last, the idea behind it endured. The city was meant to reflect harmony between governance, faith, and daily life. From the beginning, Baghdad drew people and administrators, artisans, merchants, scholars, each carrying fragments of distant worlds. The Abbasid Caliphs ruled an empire that was no longer defined by Arab lineage alone. Persians, Central Asians, Arabs, and others now participated in administration and culture. This inclusiveness reshaped Islam's public life. The Quran and prophetic tradition remained the foundation, but interpretation, law, and scholarship expanded in dialogue with inherited knowledge from earlier civilizations. It was during this period that Islamic jurisprudence, the systematic understanding of religious law, took clearer shape. Scholars traveled widely, collecting sayings of the Prophet, debating principles and forming schools of thought. These legal traditions were not imposed by force but adopted gradually, reflecting regional needs and intellectual temperaments. Law became not only a means of governance, but a form of ethical reflection. Under caliphs such as Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun Baghdad entered a period later remembered as a golden age. The city's streets glowed with lamplight after sunset. Libraries grew alongside mosques. Discussions unfolded in homes' courts and marketplaces. Learning was not confined to religious study. It embraced mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and geography. The House of Wisdom, or Bait al-Hikmah, became the most famous symbol of this intellectual flourishing. Scholars there translated works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac into Arabic. Texts by Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, and many others found new life not as static relics, but as foundations for further inquiry. Translation was an act of preservation, but also of transformation. Muslim scholars did not simply repeat what they inherited. They questioned, expanded, and corrected it. Mathematicians developed algebra. Astronomers refined star charts and instruments. Physicians wrote comprehensive medical encyclopedias that would remain influential for centuries. These pursuits were seen not as distractions from faith, but as ways of understanding God's creation more deeply. Daily life in Baghdad reflected this confidence. Markets offered goods from as far as China and East Africa. Paper newly introduced from the East made books more accessible. Poetry flourished, capturing love loss, humor, and longing with gentle precision. Music and art found places within courtly culture, even as religious scholars debated the boundaries of expression. The caliph, though powerful, was no longer the sole voice of authority. Scholars commanded respect through knowledge, rather than lineage. This balance between political power and intellectual independence gave the Abbasid world its distinctive character. Faith and reason were not seen as opposites, but as companions walking the same road. Yet beneath the brilliant strains existed. The empire was vast and distance weakened control. Provincial governors grew powerful. Military forces increasingly relied on recruited soldiers from outside traditional Arab tribes. Economic pressures mounted as administration expanded. The Caliphate remained influential, but its unity was becoming more symbolic than absolute. Still, for a time, Baghdad stood as a beacon. Its reputation spread across continents. Travelers wrote of its beauty and learning. For many, it represented the possibility of a civilization guided by both devotion and curiosity. As centuries passed, however, challenges would emerge: political fragmentation, economic shifts, and external threats. The glow of the Golden Age would soften, not vanish, as Islam entered a more complex phase of endurance and adaptation. But for now, beneath Baghdad's moonlit skies, scholars bent over manuscripts, candles flickered in quiet rooms, and the murmur of learning drifted through the night, an echo of faith seeking understanding, and understanding deepening faith. Fractures in the Caliphate time moves gently, yet it leaves traces everywhere. In Baghdad, the lamps still glowed at night, and scholars still gathered. But beneath the calm surface, the Abbasid world was changing. The Golden Age did not end in a single moment. It thinned slowly, like a mist lifting from a river at dawn, revealing a more complicated landscape beneath. As generations passed, the caliphs found it increasingly difficult to govern the vast territories that nominally answered to Baghdad. Distance weakened authority. Governors in far provinces managed armies, collected taxes, and negotiated local alliances with growing independence. The caliph's name continued to be spoken in sermons and stamped on coins, but real power often lay elsewhere. One of the most significant shifts was military. To secure loyalty and discipline, caliphs began relying on professional soldiers recruited from outside the traditional Arab population, particularly Turkic warriors from Central Asia. These soldiers were skilled, organized, and effective, but they were also loyal primarily to their commanders and paymasters. Over time, they became kingmakers, influencing succession and policy from behind palace walls. Within Baghdad itself, politics grew tense. Court intrigue replaced open consultation. Rival factions competed for influence. Some caliphs ruled confidently, others became figureheads isolated from the daily realities of governance. The balance between political authority and scholarly independence, once a source of strength, now became a fault line. At the same time, theological debates intensified. Earlier centuries had seen a rich diversity of interpretation, but now disagreements hardened into disputes. Questions about free will, divine attributes, and the nature of the Quran became sources of tension. At moments, caliphs attempted to impose theological positions by force, only to face resistance from scholars who insisted that faith could not be commanded. Beyond Baghdad, new centers of power emerged. In North Africa, in Al-Andalus, in Egypt, and in Persia, dynasties ruled with increasing autonomy. Some claimed descent from the Prophet's family. Others ruled in his name while governing independently. The Islamic world was no longer a single political body, but a shared civilization spread across many states. Yet cultural life did not simply collapse. Learning continued, often thriving in new places. Cairo, Cordoba, Nishapur, and Bukhara became centers of scholarship. Legal schools matured. Mystical traditions, later known as Sufism, gained wider influence, emphasizing inner devotion, remembrance, and love of God. For many believers, these paths offered stability amid political uncertainty. Trade routes remained active. Merchants carried goods and ideas across deserts and seas, linking Muslim lands with Africa, Europe, and Asia. Islam continued to spread peacefully through commerce and example, reaching Southeast Asia and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Faith moved with people, adapting gently to local cultures. Still, the sense of a unified caliphate faded. Authority fragmented into layers, symbolic, religious, military, and local, sometimes cooperating, sometimes colliding. The Abbasid Caliph remained a spiritual reference point, but the world no longer revolved around Baghdad alone. This fragmentation made the Islamic world resilient in some ways, yet vulnerable in others. Without centralized coordination, responses to large external threats became difficult, and such threats, though distant, were already forming beyond the horizon. In the east, steppe lands stirred. In the north, new powers watched and waited. The centuries ahead would bring shocks that no single city, no single ruler could easily withstand. For now, life went on. Prayers were still called from minarets. Students still memorized verses by lamplight. The Quran was still recited in countless voices, unchanged by the rise and fall of courts. As the Abbasid Caliphate settled into a quieter, more symbolic role, Islam itself continued less as an empire, more as a living, breathing civilization, preparing unknowingly for storms that would soon test its endurance in ways never before imagined. Empires of faith. When the great shock finally came, it arrived from the east with a speed and force that few had imagined. In the 13th century, Mongol armies swept across Central Asia, leaving devastation in their wake. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in days. In 1258, Baghdad itself was captured. The Abbasid Caliph was killed, and the city, once the heart of learning and governance, was scarred beyond recognition. The fall of Baghdad marked the end of an era, but not the end of Islam. Across the vast Islamic world, communities endured. Mosques still stood, scholars still taught, merchants still traveled. Authority had already been decentralized, and this fragmentation painful as it was allowed life to continue elsewhere. Over time, new powers rose not as restorations of the Abbasid order, but as distinct empires shaped by Islamic identity. Among the most enduring were the Ottoman Safavid and Mughal empires. Each emerged in a different region shaped by local traditions, yet bound together by shared faith. The Ottomans arose in Anatolia at the edge of the former Byzantine world. Originally a small frontier principality, they expanded, gradually absorbing territory through both conquest and alliance. Their leaders combined military skill with administrative discipline. In 1453, they captured Constantinople, transforming it into Istanbul, a new imperial capital, bridging Europe and Asia. Ottoman rule emphasized order and continuity. Islamic law operated alongside imperial decrees. Diverse religious communities, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, were organized into systems that allowed them to govern many of their own affairs. Architecture flourished with domed mosques rising above city skylines, their call to prayer echoing across stone and water. To the east, the Safavid Empire took shape in Persia. Distinct in its adoption of Shia Islam as state religion, it forged a powerful identity that reshaped the region permanently. Persian language and culture flourished under Safavid patronage, blending with Islamic scholarship and artistic expression. The divide between Sunni and Shia Islam, long present, became more firmly rooted through political borders. Further east, still the Mughal Empire spread across the Indian subcontinent. Founded by rulers of Central Asian origin, the Mughals governed a land of immense diversity. They balanced Islamic authority with accommodation of local traditions. Under emperors such as Akbar, religious tolerance and administrative reform created relative stability. Mughal architecture, from mosques to mausoleums, reflected a fusion of Islamic and Indian aesthetics. These empires represented a new phase of Islamic history. Power was no longer unified under a single caliphate. Instead, Islam functioned as a shared moral and cultural framework within multiple sovereign states. Faith provided legitimacy, law, and meaning, even as political forms differed. Beyond these imperial centers, Islam continued to travel quietly. Traders carried it along the coasts of Africa and Southeast Asia. Sufi teachers spread it through example and devotion rather than conquest. Local cultures absorbed Islamic practices, gradually weaving them into existing traditions. Despite their strength, the great empires faced their own challenges. Succession disputes, economic strain, and military competition tested stability. Over time, European powers, energized by technological and economic change, began pressing against their borders. Still, for centuries, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal realms stood as guardians of Islamic civilization, preserving learning, law, and ritual during a period of global transition. As their power slowly waned, the question of how Islam would respond to a changing world grew ever more urgent. The age of empire was giving way to something new, and the faith that had adapted so many times before would soon face challenges unlike any it had known. Encounters with the West. The centuries that followed unfolded more quietly yet with profound consequence. The great Islamic empires, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal, still stood, but the world around them was changing. Across Europe, new energies were gathering. Ships crossed oceans, machines reshaped labor, and ideas about governance, science, and economy accelerated at an unfamiliar pace. These transformations did not arrive suddenly in Muslim lands. They arrived gradually, like a distant tide, whose pull could be felt long before the water reached shore. For the Ottomans, the early modern period brought both strength and strain. Their empire remained vast, stretching across southeastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Istanbul thrived as a cosmopolitan city of scholars, artisans, merchants, and diplomats. Yet maintaining such breadth demanded resources and adaptation. Military techniques that had once guaranteed superiority began to lag behind European innovations. Cannons and muskets that had once shocked the world became commonplace, elsewhere refined and improved. Administratively, the empire struggled to balance tradition with reform. Some leaders sought renewal, modernizing the army, reorganizing taxation, streamlining law, while others feared that change would erode Islamic identity. These tensions produced periods of reform, followed by retrenchment, as the empire attempted to preserve its moral authority while competing in a rapidly shifting global order. In Persia, the Safavid Empire eventually gave way to new dynasties, but Shia Islam remained firmly rooted as the defining religious identity of the region. Religious institutions grew powerful, shaping social life and political legitimacy. The relationship between rulers and scholars became central, sometimes cooperative, sometimes contested, as both sought to define the boundaries of authority. On the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire reached remarkable cultural heights, but internal divisions and external pressures weakened it over time. European trading companies arrived first as merchants, then as power brokers. Gradually, control slipped away from imperial hands. By the 19th century, much of India had fallen under British rule, bringing with it new legal systems, economic structures, and educational models. Colonialism reshaped vast regions of the Muslim world. In North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia European powers imposed borders, extracted resources, and reorganized societies to serve distant interests. Traditional institutions were disrupted. Local economies were redirected. Religious scholars and leaders were forced to confront unfamiliar forms of domination. For many Muslims, this period provoked deep questions. How had a civilization once at the forefront of learning and governance fallen under foreign control? Was decline the result of moral failure, political mismanagement, or external circumstance? And how should faith respond through resistance, reform, or accommodation? Reform movements emerged across the Islamic world. Some thinkers called for a return to the ethical foundations of Islam, stripping away what they saw as accumulated distortions. Others argued for selective adoption of Western science and technology, believing that knowledge itself was not bound to anyone's civilization. New schools were founded. Printing presses spread ideas more widely than ever before. Debates once confined to scholarly circles reached broader audiences. Resistance also took many forms. Armed struggle arose in some regions, framed as defense of land and faith. In others, cultural preservation became the focus, maintaining language, ritual, and memory against the pressures of assimilation. Islam remained a source of identity and resilience, even as political power lay elsewhere. By the early 20th century, the old empires were fading. The Ottoman Caliphate, long a symbolic anchor, was abolished in 1924. Its end marked the close of a chapter that had linked political authority and religious leadership for centuries. In its place arose nation-states, each negotiating its own relationship with Islam. The world had changed irrevocably, yet the faith endured, carried not by empires alone, but by communities adapting to new realities. Islam now stood at a crossroads, no longer the framework of a single imperial order, but a global religion facing the modern age. As borders hardened and new ideologies spread, the story moved toward reflection, rather than conquest, toward memory and meaning, rather than dominion. And in this quieter turning of history, Islam prepared to speak again, this time not through empire, but through belief lived in countless ordinary lives. Memory, law, and belief. As the age of empires receded, Islam entered a long season of remembrance and reinterpretation. Without a single political center to define it, the faith lived increasingly in the daily practices of ordinary people, in prayer whispered at dawn, in laws debated by scholars, in stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. History no longer moved under one banner, but Islam itself remained remarkably continuous. At the heart of this continuity stood the Quran. Across continents and centuries, its words were recited in the same language, preserved through memory and careful transmission. Children learned its verses as their ancestors had done, rocking gently as they repeated each line. The sound of the Quran became one of the most enduring threads of Islamic civilization, unchanged, even as cities rose and fell around it. Alongside the Quran stood the Sunnah, the remembered example of the Prophet Muhammad. His words, actions, and silences were preserved in collections of hadith, carefully evaluated and debated by generations of scholars. These traditions shaped law, ethics, and daily conduct. They offered not only rules, but a model of balance between devotion and mercy, firmness and compassion. Islamic law, or Sharia, continued to guide communities, though its application varied widely. It was never a single code imposed uniformly, but a living tradition interpreted through established legal schools. Judges weighed evidence, intent, and context. Scholars disagreed respectfully, knowing that diversity of opinion was not a weakness, but a sign of intellectual vitality. In many places, Islamic law coexisted with local customs and modern legal systems, adapting without disappearing. For many believers, spirituality found its deepest expression in inner devotion. Sufi traditions emphasized remembrance of God, humility, and love. Poetry and music, where permitted, became vehicles for longing and reflection. Figures such as Rumi and Al-Ghazali spoke of faith not only as obedience, but as transformation of the heart. Their words traveled far beyond their own cultures, touching readers across time and language. Islam's global presence expanded quietly. In Southeast Asia, coastal communities embraced the faith through trade and teaching rather than conquest. In Africa, Islam blended with local rhythms and languages, shaping new expressions of belief. Even in lands where Muslims lived as minorities, mosques became centers of memory, anchoring identity in unfamiliar surroundings. The modern world, however, continued to pose challenges. Rapid urbanization, political upheaval, and ideological conflict forced Muslims to ask how ancient principles could guide contemporary life. Some sought answers in reform, others in preservation. Debates over authority, interpretation, and authenticity unfolded in classrooms, mosques, and public squares. Yet, despite disagreement, a shared sense of belonging endured. Pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, brought millions together each year, dissolving boundaries of nation and language. For a brief time, believers moved as one body circling the Kaaba, just as generations before them had done. The ritual linked past and present in a single, unbroken motion. Islam, now practiced by nearly 2 billion people, could no longer be defined by geography or empire. It lived in villages and megacities, in ancient languages and new ones in traditions held firmly, and interpretations still unfolding. Its history was not finished. It was ongoing, written quietly in the lives of those who carried it forward. As memory deepened and belief adapted, the story of Islam moved toward reflection rather than expansion, toward understanding how a message born in the deserts of Arabia had come to shape the inner worlds of so many. And in that reflection, the final chapter waits not as an ending, but as a gentle pause, inviting the listener to consider how time passes, how faith remains, and how history settles into silence. Beneath the same sky night falls softly across the world. In Mecca, the lights around the Grand Mosque glow against the dark, and pilgrims move in slow, patient circles. In distant cities and quiet villages, others turn toward prayer mats, windows, or open ground, lifting their thoughts toward the same unseen presence. The sky above them is vast and unchanged, the same sky that once stretched over the Arabian Peninsula in silence. The story of Islam, when traced from its beginning, does not feel like a march of conquest or a chain of rulers alone. It feels more like a long journey of meaning, carried by words spoken in a cave, preserved by memory, tested by power, and sustained by belief. From the solitude of Muhammad's reflection to the vast gatherings of today, the faith has moved through time, not as a single shape, but as a living current. Empires rose around it and faded away, capitals shifted, borders hardened and dissolved. Yet the core remained belief in one God accountability beyond this world compassion for the vulnerable and humility before creation. These ideas traveled farther than armies ever could because they traveled within people. History often records moments of conflict more clearly than moments of quiet devotion. Yet it is the quiet moments that give the story its depth. A teacher guiding a child through the first verses of the Quran, a merchant pausing at sunset to pray, a traveler finding familiarity in a distant mosque. These scenes, repeated countless times, form the true continuity of Islamic history. In the modern world, Islam stands alongside other global traditions shaped by dialogue, tension, and coexistence. It is debated, misunderstood, defended, and reimagined. But beneath these shifting conversations lies a steady rhythm: prayer, remembrance, charity, fasting, pilgrimage, anchoring lives to something older than any state or ideology. To walk through this history is to see how belief and time interact, how revelation becomes memory, how memory becomes practice, and how practice, repeated gently across centuries, becomes identity. As this long story draws to a close, there is no final triumph, no concluding empire. There is only continuity, the passing of generations, the quiet persistence of faith beneath changing skies. And so, as the centuries settle into the night, the story of Islam rests, not finished, but ongoing, like a soft recitation carried on the wind, inviting the listener to drift gently into silence, knowing that history continues patiently beyond the edge of sleep.